Yow, how goes it, YouTube? We are back again with round 3 of the Legacy 1K. So, we have two players here that are no strangers to our channel. We have on player one side, Steven playing Black Tempo, and Fernando on player two side playing his signature Infect list. So, the decks that these guys are playing, just a quick introduction to them. I'll start with Infect because it's a lot simpler. But essentially, you're an aggro combo deck where you want to land a very early Infect creature. So it's going to be Blighted Agent or Glistener Elf, or it could even be an Inkmoth Nexus. And you want to be able, like, the premise of the deck is to just put out this creature and then have a ton of pump spells to get the opponent to 10 poison counters as soon as possible, and then also have very light disruptive elements in terms of force of will, force of negation, and some sort of anti counter spell tech. It should take approximately one or two pump spells to kind of kill. It could, like, realistically it'll take three pump spells, so like a triple invigorate, or like invigorate, and so I think invigorate into invigorate and berserk to kind of get it to 10 poison counters is typically what you're going to be looking at. I know older lists played mutagenic growth, but I don't know if Fernando is playing the mutagenic growth. I think he's leaned towards more of a slower style rather than all in aggro combo. But essentially, the deck relies on very few threats to finish up the game extremely quickly. And a deck like Stevens is geared is like excellently equipped to beat this kind of deck. And the reason I say that is his deck is filled with fatal pushes and edict style effects. And when you pair up using fatal pushes and edicts against a deck that requires very few threat, you're most likely, like, you're very heavily favored, especially when you have like hand disruption in terms of Thoughtseize, and he's adopted the scam package with grief and reanimate. I think Steven is like, it is very hard for him to, unless he like draws very unluckily, it's very hard for him to lose this matchup, because he can just, like, as we're seeing here, he can pick apart Fernando's hand. Like, he just took Fernando's biggest threat. So now Fernando has to rely on this Inkmoth Nexus to kind of kill Steven. But he does have, I think there's a turn one Glistener Elf that Fernando has just top decked. This is also a new card. I think it's called Royal Treatment. So I'll throw that up on the screen. But it is from Wilds of Eldraine, and I do think it gave Infect a better chance. So here's Fernando playing turn one Noble Hierarch just to give him a little bit of a mana ramp. There's a Wasteland for the Tropical Island, and is it going to be a removal spell? Does he have a Fatal Push? There's a Fatal Push for the Noble Hierarch. So controlling the game very, very early here from Steven. There's an Inkmoth Nexus. So usually Inkmoth Nexus is a pretty hard threat to deal with. You usually need instant speed style removal to get rid of it, because it's a land, it's not a creature on your own turn. So you need your opponent to animate it, and they're usually they're only gonna animate it when they're gonna try to go for a game or try to get some damage in. But Steven has the advantage of playing the Wastelands, so he can remove the Inkmoth Nexus on his own turn, which is a pretty big deal. Because if, like, a very common play pattern back from old modern days is that you always wanted to deal with your opponent's threats on your own turn, because it makes them waste their pump spells. And it's kind of the same mentality here. If you can deal with your opponent's infect creatures on your own turn, then they're not going to be pumping them. And if you run the risk of not being able to remove the creature fully, then their pump spells are just going to kill you. So here's Steven with a Dauthi Voidwalker into a Thoughtseize. Steven reading, I think this is a bloated contaminator. So it's a 3 mana 4/4 with trample, I believe, and it has toxic. So it looks like Steven is going to take the bloated contaminator over the Glistener Elf, just because it's a lot easier for Fatal Push to remove Glistener Elf than it is the bloated contaminator. Uh, but this is why I opted to call Steven's deck Black Tempo. It's controlling really, really quickly, and it's just like beating in with this Dotty Voidwalker. So very akin to Delver's style play, but with mono black cards. So Steven has Dark Ritual, Fatal Push, Reanimate, Animate Dead. Steven opting to do nothing because he just wants to answer Fernando's threats. There's a double Inkmoth Nexus for Fernando. Swinging in for 1 poison, we're just going to immediately remove the Inkmoth Nexus. So Fernando is suffering from lack of colors here. So even though he has this Glistener Elf, there's no way for him to cast it. Steven gonna draw a Wasteland immediately and just picking apart all of Fernando's threats. So this is what I meant by earlier saying that Steven was very favored. He just has so much removal for every one of Fernando's threats. And it's very hard for Fernando to prevent a lot of these from going off. There's an Animate Dead taking a Noble Hierarch. This is going to increase Steven's clock by giving him an Exalted trigger. This will take Fernando down from 14 to 10. And he's just going to pack it up. So game 1 goes to Steven in his Black Tempo list. Alright, so players have sideboarded. We are gearing up for game 2, round 3 here at the face-to-face Toronto Legacy 1K. So I've opted to call Steven's deck Black Tempo instead of Black Midrange because he does play a little bit more aggressively in terms of both control and the threats that he's playing. Instead of going with the higher end Shield Drids and Troll of Khazad-dûms, he's relying a lot more on the 3 drops and 2 drops and Dotty Voidwalker and Opposition Agents, which I believe is a good choice and it is a meta call. Steven immediately going to mulligan to 6 here. Fernando looks like he might still be thinking. But we'll see if Fernando can crawl back here in game 2. It looks like he's keeping. Oh, still thinking. But yeah, I'm not sure like what changes can be made. You don't really want to make too many changes in the infect list. Although Fernando is running a very different style because he is much slower. Steven mulliganing to 5. But as I was saying, Fernando's playing like a slower version, so he's not all in on his threats, or he's not all in on going extremely fast. So he is willing to play kind of the slower, longer game, and kind of he's okay with chipping in with his infect creatures. However, it is going to be quite a challenge against Steven's deck, as we saw in game 1. He just had an answer for everything. But hopefully, Steven going down to 5 helps Fernando stick a threat and be able to protect it. I imagine that Fernando boarded in just a ton of Veil of Summers here. Steven looking to bottom Castle, Lochthwain, and a Wasteland. It looks like he is okay trying to deal with Inkmoth Nexus in a different way. Inkmoth Nexus relatively is like the slower play because not only do you have to spend a mana to animate it every turn, it's a lot riskier to lose a land drop to a removal spell as well. So Fernando starting off with turn 1 Glistener Elf, Steven responding with just a Swamp and passing back the turn. Fernando's going to drop a second Tropical Island and come in with a Glistener Elf. Here's a double Invigorate, so instead of paying the 3 mana for Invigorate, he's giving his opponent 3 life, and I believe it gives it +2/+2. Or is it +3/+3? I'll throw it up on the screen. It's been a while since I've seen an Invigorate, but I don't think it's lethal. So it looks like still in the combat step, there's a brainstorm. I think Fernando is just going to try to find the kill, and I think he just drew the Invigorate here. Yep, he drew a third Invigorate. So he will go to 29. Does Steven have an answer? Is it Dark Ritual into Sudden Edict? Or Shieldred's Edict? There's a Dark Ritual, and there's Daze. So this should finish the match. Or finish the game. So Fernando shows why Infect can still be extremely scary. He showed everything that we talked about at the beginning of the video, where it's just 2 to 3 pump spells, and then very light disruption for your opponent's disruption. So he had the Daze instead of the Force of Will, but it effectively did the same thing. All right, so we are going into game 3. Fernando making just a couple changes here, as he is going to be on the draw now. So Daze is going to be less effective. So I'm not sure exactly what he's sideboarding, but I assume that a couple of the Dazes came out, and another 2 pieces, disruptive pieces came in. Either he brought a little bit more slower disruption in, or he brought in just spells to go faster. So he is going to be going second, which is pretty big deal for the Infect deck. Not being able to go first and not being up 1 mana is a pretty big deal, especially when you are trying to use as much of your mana to play your threats and enable your threats with pump spells or just activating Inkmoth Nexus, and then still having mana or some way of casting your disruption spell. So it looks like Steven is keeping his hand. Fernando looks like he's contemplating his. Looks like there's a Beseiju into... I think that's his only land. So Steven's starting off with Swamp into Grief, Troll of Khazad-dûm. So exiling the Troll to play the Grief, which is fine because Steven has a backup Troll just in case. Alright, so Fernando opting to keep a very creature dense or threat dense hand with double Blighted Agent, Glistener Elf. But this is extremely risky because he doesn't have a way to cast the Blighted Agent, and he doesn't have a way of casting this Ponder to find a way to cast this Blighted Agent. So he is extremely reliant on this Beseiju into Glistener Elf and just having it survive. I think that I would have mulliganed this hand. Even though you have Glistener Elf into, like, with Force of Will protection, he only has 1 pump spell for the Glistener Elf. And against a deck like Steven's, I'm very... Like, I'm not gonna trust me keeping a creature for more than 1 or 2 turns. So here's a reanimate. This is the scam package from Steven. He's going to reanimate the Grief, and he's going to take an Invigorate. And the Invigorate is going to be exiled with a Void counter on it because the Dauthi Voidwalker is out there. So Fernando draws for turn. Steven, Fernando passes back. Steven Swamp cycles the Troll of Khazad-dûm. And that will give him a second land drop for the Shieldred's Edict that he drew for turn. So I'm not quite sure what Fernando drew for his turn. So Steven finds a Scrubland. So this is why I'm not opting to call it mono black. There is a little bit of white. But Steven gonna crack in for 6 damage. Brings Fernando down to 14. Gonna pass back to Fernando, and let's see, does he draw land? He draws a second Glistener Elf. So coming in for 1 poison. All right, passes back to Steven. Steven gonna draw for turn. It is more removal in Fatal Push. So Steven gonna swing back for a 6. Takes Fernando down to 8. Passes the turn. So most likely going to fire off the Shield's Edict at the end of the turn or in response to this Noble Hierarch. Most likely going to be in response to the Noble Hierarch. Whoa, he lets it resolve. Very interesting. So Steven going to Fatal Push the Exalted Glistener Elf now. Would it have made a difference if Steven goes up? I guess he could be afraid of Fernando's hand just being like having like pump spells, but he should know the majority of his hand, and that it's like blue spells like Double Blighted Agent Brainstorm or Double Blighted Agent Ponder is what he knows. There's a Shield's Edict. Most likely gonna. So this puts Fernando in a precarious position. Does he want to keep the Noble Hierarch and be able to cast his spells, or does he want to keep his Infector? I think you should be sacking the Glistener Elf here. Because you want to land Blighted. Oh, but he's at 2 life, so no matter what, Fernando cannot block the Daughty Voidwalker. I mean, or sorry, not the. Yeah, he can't block the Daughty Voidwalker, so he needs to find a removal spell. But that's a crop rotation. So it looks like Steven has taken it in game 3. Even if Fernando is able to put out another creature to block the Grief and its Menace ability, there's no way for him to deal with the Daughty Voidwalker. Unless there's some land that Fernando magically has that can stop the Daughty Voidwalker. There's a Tropical Island. So is this going to be used for the Ponder? I'm very curious to know what Fernando could be digging for. Blue-green doesn't have a ton of answers for creature or permanent removal. There's a Brainstorm, not a Ponder. There's Windswept Teeth, Force of Will, and Invigorate. So I don't think any of this helps him. So putting back a Ponder and a Windswept Teeth. So maybe Fernando's thinking was to draw as many pump spells as possible to try and just kill him. Because Steven has no hand. So if he was able to draw enough pump spells, he probably could have... Or if he got Glistener Elf up to at least 9 points of damage, that was like the only out. So instead of removal, he was looking for player removal. Alright, I hope you guys enjoyed this one. I will see you next time.